We're going to be on all the pictures, man. We should just be like that. Join in, Harold. Words.
I might just creep someone out and get James in there.
Jim's in the building.
Right, you're not allowed to talk because you're right next to the camera.
Hello? Hello? You started the one?
Yeah.
Now for a moment you've all been waiting for. Okay. He woke up. Did he wake up? Can he wake up? Can he still be he? Remember can they were great. Panic and shock suddenly swept him off his metaphorical feet as he soon realised he had no idea who he was, or it. A new realm. This place must have more dimensions or none at all. Maybe there is one dimension of time though. Although the more he thought about it, did anything in his brain ring true? He couldn't remember anything, all the memories fled, only language remained. But so much could be done with that if he could spin it and then spit it out onto buildings and use that to swing, from building to building, eventually becoming uncatchable and as close to unbeatable as a mere mortal can get, like Spider-Man, but with words. Spider-Man was originally a DC comic, although it became Marvel's, although not many people know that. Another fact that many people don't know is as it was also based on a true story. Well, a true false story. And now, a man named Peter Parker in 1911 went to, at the time, a secret experimental genetics lab in America called the Mentage Laboratory. It was when he visited this lab, he was bitten by two weird spiders. 2 bites on his back, 1 on each wrist, and 1, most painful of all, I assume, on his testicles. Although, not painful actually, because apparently this radioactive spider numbs the enemy first. Now of course, I'm not a crazy conspiracy theorist. I'm not suggesting the spider gave him web-slinging abilities. That would be ridiculous. But it did lead people to believe, and this is why I mentioned it was a true false story, listeners, that he was some sort of Spider-Man mutant thing. But when he was found dead in a river heavily populated with frogs, an autopsy revealed the truth. While he was bitten by radioactive spiders, which messed with his bloodstream and his reproductive organs, it hadn't poisoned his mind, so there was no explanation for him disappearing and going rogue. What in fact happened was that prior to this trip, he had been infected by the parasite, the Gordian worms, that usually inhabit insects, though evidently can affect humans too. What it does when inside the host is to completely hotwire the brain, pulling apart and messing with all the signals, driving these animals to suicide, usually in ponds where the parasite can then survive and evolve. So Peter Parker was incredibly unlucky to be bitten by both a mind-affecting parasite and a body-altering spider. The parasite had a particularly weird effect on Parker's mind, as he went on to commit several rapes during the night in New York. It is said that he was gay, but times back then weren't so accepting, and this had a lot of repressed sexual feelings. So when the parasite was starting to mess with his mind, it seemed he went mad and forcefully made up for lost time. In the months that he was on the run, missing, before the months of idiosyncratic rapes, he committed. The radioactive spider seemed to have injected a lot of extra testosterone, and when he was found dead, he had grown 3 to 4 stone, mainly in muscle. What became apparent was that before the parasite had completely controlled Parker's mind, he was acting on perverse testosterone-fueled, half-hot-wired instincts with no self-control to rape citizens in New York. His newfound strength made anyone a target, even gangsters. So, a rumour of a super mutant spider vigilante appeared. Now, I hear you ask, why Spider-Man and not Superman or Batman? And I sort of wish you hadn't asked that, although you haven't asked that because you've all been quiet and I'm sort of just making this up. But, for the purpose of the story, you've asked that in your mind. So. And this is where it gets weird. And I wish you hadn't asked that, even though you haven't asked that. But here we go. When he got bitten, like I said earlier, he got bitten in his testicles. And there was a lot of extra testosterone. which meant that there were some serious bodily fluid changes. So, after raping these poor victims of New York, he would literally offload pints of the weird mutant stuff onto his victims. When they were found, they seemed to be caught in a web, and all the victims, shocked and horrified, didn't know what to make of it. At the time, no one except the Daily Bugle, a genuine newspaper at the time, took this story seriously, as CIA disinformants made sure there's no substantial evidence to support this case. And in the 60s, to further quell any leaking of information, the CIA asked comic book writers to invent a Spider-Man story, which seems incredibly immoral, considering Spider-Man's catchphrase, "Your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man." Which is so inconsiderate to the poor victims in New York who fell victim to a far over-friendly spider mutant. And that's the truth about Spider-Man you never knew existed. Back to the fiction. As it turns out, our main protagonist actually did remember who he was, so I guess that whole first part was pointless as well. His name was Tom, and he's 35. He was the first human to go. He was working in the right field, so naturally he was curious. And perhaps most important of all, he was sick of the narratives that surrounded him. Literature, cinema, journalism, everything, further perpetuating myths he couldn't bear. Rock and roll fantasy, the American dream, they could all make him weep. He was a natural target. So the indestructible and everlasting tabernacle crept up behind him and stuck a dematerializing tentacle to the back of his head, sucking him up to the space that takes up no space. Dazed and confused, Tom was transported to the underground. Here he came across an old friend with a wooden leg. His wooden leg friend was accompanied by a beautiful girl with Tom, who Tom especially liked, especially as she laughed at his joke. They led Tom down the tunnel, but only 10 paces in, the white light of a train began to flood the darkness. They managed to get out in time, at the same end they came in. Through fear of getting run over by another train, Tom went back to his flat, which he never knew he had. When he was at the flat that he never knew he had, there was a knock on the door, and his wooden-legged friend came up and with a pretty girl. To impress the pretty girl at this party that he didn't know was happening, but was happening at his house that he didn't know he had, there was this game, the potato game. During the course of this night, the potato picking game was about picking the best potato. Tom, being the cunning genius that he is, knew the greatest potato there, the hot potato in the room. Floating there, it was clear he could easily impress the girl with his potato picking skills. That's the best potato. For a second he wondered whether the potato was even prettier than the girl, and contemplated picking another potato to impress the best potato. But that thought slipped away like many others. He approached the potato, but as soon as he touched his face became numb and he helplessly fell to the floor. Then the massive steel pan tipped tons of baked beans onto his body. Dazed and confused, he disappeared from the underground. He seemed to materialise into an old England. It was a strange place. He walked to a bar, which seemed to have bankers from his own time, the 21st century, if that indeed was his own time. They were involved in a scheme where they had rigged a random gambling system for their favour. For some reason, they recognised him as a friend. So amongst the bankers, he spoke to them and soon realised they wasted no time to talk to him and failed to hold back their secret. Asked whether he could keep a secret, he said of course, knowing he could use it against them. After hearing of their plans, he left and never saw them again. He desperately searched for a home that could be his, but instead found his feet leading him to the Temple of Love. He stepped inside. To be continued.